There comes a point when companionship stops feeling like peace and starts feeling like noise you agreed to carry just to avoid your own silence. Not every attachment enters your life as chaos. Some arrive gently, familiar, comforting, reasonable. But over time you begin to notice the cost. Your judgment weakens, your focus scatters. Your self-respect becomes something you negotiate in quiet moments no one else sees. Most people do not fear love. They fear stillness. They fear the unguarded hour, the empty room, the mind with no distraction left to answer to but itself. So they bind themselves to what is available, not what is right, and little by little they drift further from their own center. But there is another path, a quieter one, a stronger one. To remain alone for a season, not out of bitterness but out of discipline, to step back, to see clearly, to rebuild a life governed by reason rather than need. Because love means nothing when it is chosen from fear. There is a kind of disappointment that does not arrive all at once. It does not break down the door. It enters quietly. It sits beside you in the ordinary moments. In the long drive home after another conversation that left you more tired than understood. In the silence after a message you waited too long to receive. In the strange heaviness of lying next to someone and still feeling alone. That is how most inner disturbances begin, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a slow recognition that something in your life is asking too much of you and giving too little back. Most people do not admit this early enough. They keep calling it patience. They call it loyalty. They call it love. But if you sit still long enough, if you become honest enough to hear your own thoughts without rushing to escape them, another word begins to appear: misalignment. A life that looks acceptable from the outside, yet quietly pulls you away from your center. A bond that asks for your time, your attention, your emotional steadiness, your self-respect, and gives you confusion in return. Not always cruelty, not always betrayal in the obvious sense. Sometimes just a constant low pressure that makes you abandon yourself by degrees. That is what makes the wrong attachment so dangerous. It does not always wound you in one clean strike. It teaches you to betray your own judgment slowly. It persuades you to ignore what you can already see. You notice the inconsistency, but you explain it away. You feel the tension, but you tell yourself you are overthinking. You sense that your peace is beginning to depend on someone else's mood, someone else's attention, someone else's approval, and still you remain. Not because the arrangement is good, but because the alternative seems too quiet, too exposed, too honest. And that is the part few people want to face. The fear is rarely love leaving. The fear is having to meet yourself without distraction. Because when there is no one to text, no one to wait for, no one to explain yourself to, no one to impress, no one to manage, something uncomfortable happens. You are returned to your own mind. And if your inner life has been neglected, if your thoughts have been scattered for years by noise, performance, and dependence, that return can feel almost unbearable at first. So people cling to what exhausts them because exhaustion feels more familiar than stillness. The Stoics understood this with brutal clarity. A man is not free simply because no one is visibly controlling him. He is free when his judgment is no longer held hostage by appetite, fear, or approval. He is free when he can remain with himself without panic. He is free when he stops reaching for outside solutions to inner disorder. That is why singleness in the right season is not deprivation. It is exposure. And exposure, though uncomfortable, is often the beginning of truth. You begin to see how much of your life was shaped by avoidance. How often you said yes because silence felt harder. How often you accepted confusion because clarity would have required you to walk away. How often you mistook being chosen for being valued. These are not easy recognitions. They bruise the ego. They disturb the story you told yourself about why you stayed, why you tolerated, why you waited. But they also return something to you. They return your sight. I think this is why some seasons of being alone feel heavier than others. It is not simply the absence of companionship. It is the collapse of illusion. You are no longer protected by the fantasy that another person will fix your restlessness, organize your identity, or rescue you from the work of governing yourself. you begin to understand that many attachments were never built on peace at all. They were built on fear of emptiness, fear of rejection, fear of insignificance, fear of facing an unformed self. A man can spend years trying to be loved while never asking whether he has become someone he respects. He can become skilled at being available, desirable, agreeable, useful, emotionally responsive, and still remain inwardly weak. That weakness does not always show in public. It appears in private compromises, in how easily he abandons his routine when someone disapproves, in how quickly his peace is disturbed by distance, in how much of his mind is consumed by interpretation, waiting, second-guessing, and emotional negotiation. This is not strength. It is dependence dressed in softer language. To remain single for a time, then, is not merely to avoid the wrong person. It is to interrupt a pattern. It is to stop handing your inner order over to circumstances you do not control. It is to stop asking another person to settle questions that should have been settled within your own character. What do you value? What will you no longer tolerate? What kind of life are you building? What standards govern your time? What habits protect your peace? What truths have you been postponing because attachment made delay feel easier? These questions do not always get answered in company. Often they are answered in solitude, when there is no audience to impress and no emotional weather to adapt to. You rise at an hour no one asked you to. You keep your word to yourself when no one is watching. You stop reaching for your phone the moment discomfort appears. You sit in the quiet long enough for your mind to settle. You notice how much clearer life becomes when your thoughts are no longer entangled in someone else's instability. There is a subtle dignity in that. A man making coffee in the early morning with no need to check whether he has upset anyone. A walk taken without explanation. A room that stays peaceful because no chaos has been invited into it. Time that remains intact. Thought that remains uninterrupted. A life that begins to belong to its rightful owner again. At first, this can feel empty to those who are used to noise, but emptiness is often just unused space, and unused space, when guarded properly, becomes the ground on which a stronger self is built. Not a louder self, not a colder self, a steadier one. A man who no longer mistakes constant emotional activity for meaning. A man who stops chasing intensity and starts valuing order. A man who learns that self-respect is not declared in public. It is demonstrated in what he refuses to keep entertaining. So before we speak about rebuilding standards, discipline, or purpose, we have to begin here, with the disturbance beneath the attachment, with the hidden bargain so many people make. I will trade my clarity for company. I will trade my standards for closeness. I will trade my peace for the chance not to be alone. That bargain always costs more than it promises, and the first act of wisdom is to see the cost clearly. Because the moment you stop calling your disturbance love, you begin to recover the strength to walk toward a quieter life, not an empty one, a truer one. Once you step away from the noise of attachment, the first thing you notice is not peace. It is withdrawal, not from a person alone, but from a pattern, from the habit of checking, waiting, adjusting, hoping, interpreting, from the constant low-grade occupation of your mind by someone else's presence, someone else's absence, someone else's shifting moods. People often say they miss the person, but what they really miss at first is the structure of distraction. They miss having somewhere to place their restlessness. They miss the routine of emotional dependence, because dependence, however exhausting, can still feel familiar. And the mind, when it has not yet been trained by reason, tends to prefer what is familiar over what is true. This is where many people go back, not because the attachment was good, but because solitude begins to expose things they have postponed for years. It shows them how undisciplined their thoughts have become. How often they reach outside themselves for reassurance, how quickly their mood collapses when no one is there to reflect worth back to them. A man can tell himself he wants freedom, but the moment freedom becomes quiet and unadorned, he starts mistaking it for loss. He forgets that a life governed by constant emotional reaction was never peace to begin with. It was only occupation. A full calendar is not the same as a full life. A constant stream of messages is not the same as connection. Being wanted is not the same as being understood. And being with someone is certainly not the same as being at rest. The Stoic response to this moment is not to rush and fill the silence again. It is to study it, to remain there long enough to see what it reveals. Epictetus was relentless about this. He kept returning to one hard distinction: what is within your control and what is not. The attention of another person is not yours to command. Their consistency is not yours to demand. Their loyalty, their feelings, their timing, their level of maturity, their willingness to understand you, none of it belongs to your domain. Yet many people spend years arranging their peace around these things as if anxiety could force them into obedience. They wait for replies as if waiting itself were an action. They rehearse conversations in their head as if thought could govern another soul. They monitor tone delays, distance gestures, trying to manage what was never theirs to manage. This is not love guided by reason. It is judgment surrendered to uncertainty. When you become single and stay there with discipline, you begin to reclaim that judgment. You start to see how much of your suffering came not from reality itself, but from the story you kept building around it. A late reply becomes disrespect in your imagination. A quiet evening becomes proof of your unworthiness. A change in behavior becomes something you must decode at the expense of your peace. Seneca warned that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, and nowhere is that more visible than in unstable attachment. You do not merely endure what happened, you multiply it with interpretation. You build an inner courtroom and put yourself on trial every night. You ask what you did wrong, what you should have said differently, how you could have made yourself more acceptable, more appealing, more unforgettable. All the while your real life waits in the next room neglected. This is why solitude, though difficult, can become a form of correction. It takes away the immediate object of obsession and forces your perception to stand on its own. At first the mind rebels. It keeps reaching. It wants stimulation, confirmation, interruption. It wants to be pulled out of itself. But if you do not obey that impulse, if you let the craving pass without feeding it, something begins to shift. You notice that not every feeling deserves a response. Not every lonely night is an emergency. Not every moment of emptiness means something is missing from your life. Sometimes emptiness is simply the space left behind when confusion has finally stopped speaking. Sometimes what feels like loneliness is only your nervous system adjusting to peace. There is a quiet humiliation in realizing how much of your life was governed by the desire to be chosen. Most people never say it plainly, but it sits beneath their decisions. They choose what will make them more acceptable. They soften what is true to remain desirable. They tolerate what insults them because being tolerated feels safer than being alone. They let standards weaken in exchange for attention. Then they call the result compromise, when in reality it is fear wearing a respectable face. To become single and remain composed inside it means you are no longer willing to make fear the architect of your relationships. You would rather endure the clean ache of solitude than the daily erosion of self-respect. That choice changes the way you see people. When you are not desperate, you observe better. You hear the inconsistency behind the charm. You notice when someone is drawn to access rather than to character. You see the difference between someone who enjoys your presence and someone who enjoys your availability. Need distorts perception. It makes you ignore what would otherwise be obvious. But restraint sharpens it. The man who is willing to remain alone is harder to deceive because he is not bargaining with reality. He does not need every encounter to become promise. He does not turn small gestures into future meaning. He can let people reveal themselves at their natural pace because he is no longer in a hurry to belong to anyone. There is a simple image that often comes to mind here. A room after a storm has passed. Nothing dramatic, just the faint disarray left behind. A chair slightly out of place, dust on the floor, a silence that feels different now. That is what the inner life feels like after attachment loosens its grip. You begin to notice what was disturbed. Your sleep, your concentration, your routine, your capacity for stillness, your standard for what deserves entry into your life. And once you see that clearly, you cannot unsee it. You begin cleaning inwardly. Not with resentment, not with grand declarations, just with steadier choices. You stop reopening doors that lead to confusion. You stop revisiting conversations that have already shown you enough. You stop volunteering your peace to people who treat it casually. What grows in that cleared space is not bitterness, at least not if you are doing the work honestly. Bitterness is still a form of attachment because it keeps your attention chained to what injured you. Stoic detachment is different. It is not emotional numbness. It is the refusal to let old disturbances continue governing your present life. It is memory without servitude. It is clarity without obsession. You remember what happened, but you do not kneel to it. You let it instruct your standards instead of poison your spirit. This is where being single begins to reveal its real value. Not as a statement to the world, not as a performance of independence, but as a disciplined season in which perception is restored. You begin to separate hunger from love, loneliness from truth, intensity from compatibility, attention from respect. And those distinctions matter because without them, you will keep repeating the same mistake under different names. Different face, same confusion. Different promise, same self-abandonment. Different beginning, same ending. So the work here is not merely to remain alone. It is to remain awake while alone, to watch your own mind with more honesty than comfort, to ask why silence unsettles you, to ask what kind of company you have been using to avoid your own unfinished life, to ask what standards you abandoned the last time you were afraid someone might leave. These are not pleasant questions, but they are clean ones. They cut through performance. They return you to what is solid, and from that solidity, a different kind of life becomes possible. A life where attachment is no longer used to escape yourself, but approached only when it aligns with truth, discipline, and peace. That is the beginning of real freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever feels good in the moment, but the freedom to see clearly and choose accordingly. The freedom to stop calling dependency devotion. The freedom to let silence remain silence without rushing to break it. The freedom to stand in your own company and not treat that as failure. Because once perception is corrected, the entire road changes. You are no longer searching for someone to complete the life you have neglected. You are beginning at last to build a life that does not collapse when no one is there to witness it. When desperation enters the picture, judgment begins to bend in ways that are almost invisible at first. It does not announce itself clearly. It disguises itself as hope, as optimism, as the willingness to give things time. But underneath it, there is a quiet urgency that pushes you to accept what you would normally question. You overlook what feels wrong because the alternative feels too uncertain. You move faster than your understanding. You invest before you observe. And once you are invested, it becomes harder to step back because now it is not just about truth, it is about what you have already given away. This is how many people find themselves entangled in something they knew from the beginning was not right. There was always a moment early on when the signal appeared. Not dramatic, not undeniable, but clear enough for a calm mind to recognize. A lack of consistency, a subtle disrespect, a mismatch in values. A feeling that something had to be managed instead of naturally aligned. But desperation narrows perception. It replaces observation with projection. Instead of seeing what is, you start focusing on what could be. You begin building a version of the person in your mind that does not yet exist, and then you commit to that version instead of the reality in front of you. The Stoics would call this a failure of judgment. Not because you lacked intelligence, but because you allowed desire to interfere with clarity. Epictetus warned repeatedly that when you attach your well-being to something outside your control, you make yourself vulnerable to disturbance. Yet people continue to do this in relationships more than anywhere else. They place their peace in the hands of someone who has not yet demonstrated the capacity to hold it. They give their attention before respect is established. They offer loyalty before stability is proven. And then when the structure begins to collapse, they call it heartbreak, when in many cases it was simply misjudgment sustained for too long. There is a difference between patience and tolerance of disorder. Patience is grounded in reason. It observes, it waits, it tests, it allows reality to unfold without interference. But tolerance, when driven by fear, becomes a slow erosion of standards. You keep adjusting yourself to preserve something that was never stable to begin with. You tell yourself that time will fix what character has not yet built. You tell yourself that understanding will create respect. You tell yourself that effort will generate consistency, and all the while your own position weakens because you are negotiating with something that is not governed by the same principles you are trying to apply. This is where restraint becomes essential, not as a form of coldness but as a form of self-respect. Restraint means you do not rush to attach meaning to every interaction. It means you do not assume closeness where there is only proximity. It means you allow space for behavior to reveal itself without filling in the gaps with your own imagination. Most people struggle with this because restraint feels like inaction, and inaction feels like risk. They fear that if they do not move quickly, they will lose the opportunity, but what they often lose instead is clarity. They trade the slow certainty of truth for the fast comfort of illusion. There is a certain discipline required to remain still when something in you wants to move forward, to hold back your attention, to observe longer than feels comfortable, to ask whether what you are seeing is consistent, grounded, and aligned with the life you are trying to build. This discipline is not passive. It is active control over impulse. It is the ability to say not yet, not because you are unsure of your worth, but because you are sure of your standards. That distinction changes everything. You are no longer waiting to be chosen. You are choosing what deserves to remain. I remember a period where the pattern became obvious only after repetition. Different faces, different conversations, different beginnings, but the same quiet dissatisfaction underneath. At first it was easy to blame circumstance, wrong timing, miscommunication, bad luck, but eventually a harder truth appeared. The common element was not the people. It was my own unwillingness to remain alone long enough to see clearly. I was stepping into situations before they had revealed themselves fully and then trying to correct them from within. That approach always comes at a cost, because once you are inside, your perspective is no longer neutral. You begin defending what you should be evaluating. This is why staying single with discipline interrupts that cycle. It removes the urgency that distorts judgment. It gives you the space to rebuild a standard that is not influenced by immediate desire. You begin to ask different questions. Not how do I keep this, but should this be kept at all? Not how do I make this work, but does this align with what I am trying to build? These are not emotional questions. They are structural. They determine whether what you are engaging with has the capacity to support a stable life or whether it will require constant adjustment to sustain. There is also a quiet confidence that begins to develop when you no longer feel the need to act on every impulse. You notice that nothing collapses when you choose restraint. You notice that your value does not decrease when you do not immediately respond. You notice that your presence becomes more grounded when it is not driven by urgency. This kind of confidence is not loud. It does not seek validation. It is simply the result of seeing that you can remain composed in situations where you once would have reacted, and once you experience that, it becomes difficult to return to the old pattern. The idea of chasing attention begins to feel misaligned. The idea of explaining yourself to someone who has not earned that level of access begins to feel unnecessary. You begin to move differently, not because you are trying to appear strong, but because you have removed the internal pressure that made you act prematurely before. Most people underestimate how much of their past frustration could have been avoided with a little more restraint at the beginning. Not as a guarantee against disappointment, but as a filter, a way of preventing misaligned connections from progressing to a point where they begin to shape your life. Because once something has time to grow, even if it is unstable, it becomes harder to detach without consequence. That is why the early stage matters so much. That is where judgment is still clean. That is where your standards are still intact. That is where a calm decision can save you from a long period of unnecessary complication. To live this way requires a shift in how you measure progress. It is no longer about how quickly something develops, but about how solid it is at each stage. It is no longer about intensity, but about consistency. It is no longer about being wanted, but about being respected. These are quieter metrics, but they are more reliable. They do not fluctuate with mood or attention. They remain stable, and because of that, they protect you. Restraint, then, is not a limitation. It is a form of protection. It guards your time, your attention, and your emotional stability from being invested in something that has not yet earned it. It keeps your judgment clear long enough for reality to show itself. And in doing so, it prevents the slow loss of self that comes from committing too early to something that cannot support you. This is where the deeper strength of singleness begins to take shape, not as isolation, but as control. Control over when you engage, how you engage, and why you engage. You are no longer reacting to loneliness. You are responding to truth, and that shift, though subtle, marks the difference between a life shaped by impulse and a life shaped by discipline. There is a quiet theft that happens in the wrong relationships, and most people do not recognize it until much later. It is not always loud or obvious. It does not always look like conflict or betrayal. Sometimes it looks like small compromises that accumulate over time. A morning you planned for yourself that becomes rearranged. An evening you intended to use well that gets absorbed into someone else's unpredictability. A routine that once gave you structure slowly dissolves because you are constantly adjusting to someone else's pace. Nothing dramatic, just a gradual shift where your time stops belonging fully to you. At first it feels like part of being connected. You tell yourself this is what it means to care, to be flexible, to meet someone halfway. But there is a difference between sharing time and surrendering control of it. When you are in the wrong situation, your time is no longer guided by your priorities. It is shaped by negotiation. You begin to wait for availability, for mood, for approval. You delay what matters to you because something else feels more immediate, even if it is not more important. And the more you repeat this pattern, the more your life begins to orbit around something that was never meant to define it. This is where singleness becomes less about absence and more about recovery. Not emotional recovery in the way people often describe it, but structural recovery. You start to reclaim ownership over your hours. You wake up without needing to check how your presence will be received. You move through your day without having to account for someone else's reactions. Your schedule becomes yours again, not because you are avoiding connection, but because you are restoring order. The Stoics placed immense value on time, not as a concept, but as a lived resource. Seneca spoke about it with a kind of urgency that most people ignore until they feel the weight of lost years. He pointed out that we guard our money carefully, yet we give away our time with almost no resistance, and nowhere is that more evident than in relationships that do not nourish you. Hours spent explaining yourself, hours spent resolving the same misunderstandings, hours spent waiting for clarity that never comes. These are not small losses. They shape the direction of your life. When you are single and disciplined within that state, something becomes clear very quickly. Time expands, not because there are more hours in the day, but because fewer of them are wasted in confusion. You begin to see how much you can accomplish when your attention is not fragmented. You notice how your thoughts settle when they are not constantly interrupted by emotional uncertainty. You find that your energy remains more stable because it is not being drained by unnecessary tension. There is a certain clarity that comes from having uninterrupted time. You begin to recognize patterns in yourself that were previously hidden. How you think in the morning before the day begins, how your focus rises and falls depending on how you use your attention. What habits strengthen you and which ones weaken you. These are not discoveries that happen easily in a life filled with constant emotional negotiation. They require space. And space requires the discipline to remain unoccupied when occupation is available. I remember how uncomfortable that space can feel at first. There is an impulse to fill it immediately, to reach for something, someone, anything that interrupts the stillness. Because stillness has a way of exposing what you have been avoiding. It shows you where your time has been misused. It shows you how often you have chosen distraction over direction. It shows you the gap between what you say matters and how you actually live. And for a moment that realization can feel heavier than the chaos you left behind. But if you stay with it, something changes. The same stillness that once felt empty begins to feel ordered. You start to build a rhythm that is not dependent on external input. You wake up at a consistent hour because you have chosen to, not because your schedule is reacting to someone else's needs. You begin your day with intention, not reaction. You move through your work with focus because your mind is not divided. And in the evening you close your day without the residue of unresolved tension. This is not a dramatic transformation. It is subtle, quiet, but it is powerful. Because once your time is structured around your own values, your life begins to move in a direction that is consistent. You are no longer pulled in different directions by different expectations. You are not constantly shifting your priorities to maintain something unstable. You become steady not because life is easy, but because your foundation is no longer scattered. There is also a deeper level to this that most people overlook. When your time is not yours, your identity begins to blur. You become what is needed in the moment rather than what is true. You respond instead of act. You adjust instead of decide. And over time, you lose the sense of what you would choose if you were not constantly accommodating something else. That loss is not immediate. It happens gradually until one day you realize you are no longer certain of your own direction. Singleness interrupts that process. It gives you the space to ask questions that have been postponed. What do you actually want your days to look like? What kind of work are you willing to commit to consistently? What habits are non-negotiable for your growth? What standards govern how your time is spent? These are not questions that can be answered once and forgotten. They require repetition. They require alignment between thought and action. And they require the absence of constant interference. There is a quiet discipline in protecting your time once you begin to understand its value. You stop saying yes to things that do not align, not out of arrogance but out of clarity. You recognize that every commitment carries a cost, and you are no longer willing to pay that cost for something that does not move your life forward. You become more selective, not because you are trying to control everything, but because you are finally taking responsibility for what you allow to shape your days. This is where the idea of freedom becomes more concrete. It is not the freedom to do anything at any time. It is the freedom to direct your life according to reason rather than impulse, to choose what deserves your attention and what does not, to invest your time in things that build you rather than things that drain you. And that kind of freedom cannot exist when your schedule is constantly being negotiated by someone else's instability. When you learn to guard your time in this way, it changes how you approach future connections. You no longer offer access freely. You observe whether someone respects your time before you give them more of it. You notice whether their presence adds structure or introduces disorder. You become less tolerant of patterns that disrupt your focus, because you have already experienced the value of clarity. And this is where the deeper benefit reveals itself. You're not just protecting your time in the present, you are shaping your future. Every hour you spend building yourself compounds. It strengthens your discipline, it sharpens your thinking, it stabilizes your identity. And over time, those small, consistent investments create a life that is difficult to disrupt. Most people do not lose their direction in one moment. They lose it in small increments through time given away without awareness. And most people do not rebuild their life through a single decision. They rebuild it through the quiet discipline of reclaiming their time one day at a time without the need to explain that decision to anyone else. This is the second layer of staying single, not just avoiding what is wrong, but restoring what is yours. Not just stepping away from distraction, but learning how to use your time with intention. And once that foundation is in place, something else becomes possible. Not just clarity, but control over how you live, how you think, and how you move forward without being pulled off course. Once your time begins to return to you, something deeper comes into view. Not just what you do with your hours, but how you govern yourself within them. Because structure alone is not enough. Many people can build a schedule, but very few can sustain discipline when no one is watching. That is where singleness reveals its true function. It removes the audience. It removes the pressure to perform. And what remains is a quieter question. Can you lead yourself when there is no one to impress and no one to disappoint but your own judgment? This is where most people struggle, not because they lack ambition, but because they have spent too long operating in reaction. Their habits were shaped around other people. Their energy rose and fell depending on emotional circumstances. Their consistency depended on how they felt in the moment. And when all of that is stripped away, when there is no longer someone else influencing the rhythm of their life, they are left with something unfamiliar. Responsibility without distraction. At first, this can feel like resistance. You tell yourself you will wake up earlier, but there is no external force to hold you to it. You say you will train, read, work, build, but the only voice enforcing that decision is your own. And that voice, if it has not been strengthened, is easily negotiated with. This is why discipline is not a personality trait. It is a practiced form of self-command. It is built through repetition, not intention. The Stoics were clear about this. You do not become strong by thinking about strength. You become strong by acting in alignment with what you know is right, even when it is inconvenient. Especially when it is inconvenient, because that is where the test exists. Not in moments of inspiration, but in moments of resistance, when the mind looks for an easier path, when the body prefers comfort over effort, when no one would notice if you stopped. That is where character is either built or abandoned.
Singleness creates the conditions for this kind of work. There are no emotional interruptions to excuse inconsistency, no late-night arguments to justify a lack of focus the next day, no shifting priorities to explain why your routine fell apart. What remains is clear. Either you do the work or you do not. Either you keep your word to yourself or you break it. And the more you observe that pattern, the more you begin to understand that discipline is not about perfection. It is about reliability. There is something powerful in becoming reliable to yourself, not in a dramatic sense, but in small, consistent actions. Waking up at the time you said you would, completing the task you set for the day, following through on the commitments that no one else can see. These actions do not bring immediate recognition. They do not produce visible rewards in the short term, but they build something more important: trust in your own judgment. Because once you begin to trust yourself, your entire approach to life changes. You no longer depend on motivation to act. You no longer wait for the right mood. You move because you have decided, and your decision holds weight. That is the foundation of self-mastery. Not controlling everything around you, but controlling your response to what is required. I remember a period where the absence of distraction revealed how fragmented my habits had become. It was easy to blame circumstances before, busy days, emotional stress, unpredictable situations. But once those variables were removed, the truth was harder to avoid. The inconsistency was internal. It was not about time or opportunity. It was about the lack of discipline to follow through when no one else was involved. That realization is not comfortable. It removes the ability to assign responsibility elsewhere. It forces you to confront the gap between what you say you value and how you actually behave. But it also creates an opportunity, because once you see the gap clearly, you can begin to close it deliberately. You start with simple structures, a fixed morning routine, a defined period of focused work, a commitment to physical training, not because these things are impressive, but because they are stabilizing. They create a baseline, a standard that does not fluctuate with emotion, and over time that baseline becomes stronger. What once required effort becomes automatic. What once felt difficult becomes expected. This is how discipline compounds, not through intensity, but through consistency. Small actions repeated over time that gradually reshape how you operate. You begin to notice that your mind becomes quieter, not because life is easier, but because you are no longer negotiating with yourself constantly. You make a decision and you follow it. That removes a significant amount of internal friction. There is also a shift in how you view discomfort. It stops being something to avoid and becomes something to engage with, not recklessly but deliberately. You understand that growth does not come from ease. It comes from controlled difficulty.
From choosing to do what is necessary even when it does not feel good in the moment. And in doing so, you build resilience that cannot be taken from you. Most people associate discipline with restriction. They see it as limiting their freedom. But in reality, it does the opposite. It removes chaos. It reduces uncertainty. It gives structure to your actions and clarity to your decisions. And that clarity creates a form of freedom that is far more stable than the freedom to act on impulse. When you are disciplined, you are no longer pulled in multiple directions by every passing desire. You are anchored. You know what you are doing and why you are doing it. That does not make life rigid. It makes it intentional. And intention is what separates a life that drifts from a life that moves with purpose. This is why singleness, when approached correctly, becomes a training ground, not for isolation, but for control. Control over your habits, your time, your attention, your responses. It is a period where you can build without interference, where you can establish standards that are not influenced by external pressure, where you can become someone who does not need constant adjustment to remain stable. And once that stability is built, it changes how you interact with the world. You are no longer looking for someone to organize your life. You are no longer hoping that connection will bring you structure. You bring that structure with you, and because of that you become less tolerant of anything that disrupts it. That is the difference between someone who has used their time alone well and someone who has simply passed through it. One emerges with clarity and strength. The other returns to the same patterns, only more aware of their consequences. So the work here is not to fill your time, it is to use it with discipline to build habits that reinforce your values, to act in alignment with what you know is right, regardless of how you feel in the moment. Because over time, that alignment becomes identity, not something you claim, but something you demonstrate. And when that identity is stable, when your actions consistently reflect your judgment, something changes in how you move through life. You are no longer easily influenced. You are no longer easily distracted. You are no longer easily shaken. You have built a foundation that does not depend on circumstance. That is the real strength of this season, not the absence of others, but the presence of self-command. And once that is established, everything that follows rests on something solid. There is a kind of influence that does not look like control at first. It does not raise its voice. It does not force your hand. It simply lingers. It shifts your mood in subtle ways. It makes you question things you were once certain about. It introduces tension where there used to be clarity, and over time, without you noticing it, begins to shape how you think, how you act, and how you see yourself. This is how toxic entanglement works, not through one decisive moment, but through repeated exposure to something that slowly alters your internal state. Most people expect toxicity to be obvious. They look for clear signs. Disrespect, dishonesty, open conflict. But in reality, the more damaging forms are often quieter. Inconsistency that keeps you unsettled. A tension that appears and disappears without explanation. A tone that shifts just enough to make you unsure of where you stand. It creates a kind of instability that requires constant adjustment. And in that adjustment, your energy begins to drain. The Stoics would approach this not as a question of emotion, but of environment. What you allow near you shapes what you become. Not because you are weak, but because the mind adapts to what it is exposed to repeatedly. If your daily experience is filled with unpredictability, your thoughts become scattered. If your interactions are filled with tension, your internal state begins to mirror that tension. You carry it into other areas of your life, your work, your habits, your decisions. It does not stay contained. This is why protecting your inner life is not optional. It is a responsibility, not in a defensive sense, but in a disciplined one. You must decide what is allowed to occupy your mind. Not everything deserves your attention. Not every person deserves access to your time. And not every connection deserves continuation simply because it began. There is a tendency to tolerate more than you should because you have already invested time, attention, emotional effort. You tell yourself that walking away would make all of that meaningless. But that is a misunderstanding. What is truly wasted is not what you leave behind, but what you continue to give to something that does not improve your life. The longer you stay, the more you lose. Not always in visible ways, but in the subtle erosion of your clarity, your focus, your self-respect. I remember recognizing this not through a single realization, but through a pattern, a consistent drop in energy after certain interactions, a lingering distraction that followed conversations, a shift in my mood that I could not explain rationally yet could not ignore. At first it was easy to dismiss. Everyone has difficult moments. Every connection has some level of tension, but over time the pattern became undeniable. It was not occasional, it was structural. That is when the Stoic principle becomes necessary. You do not ask how to fix what is outside your control. You ask whether it belongs in your life at all, because once something consistently disrupts your internal order, it becomes a liability. And it is your responsibility to remove liabilities, not manage them indefinitely. This is where many people hesitate, not because they do not see the problem, but because they are uncomfortable with the act of cutting something off. It feels harsh, it feels final, it feels like failure. But in reality, it is alignment. It is the decision to stop exposing yourself to something that weakens you. And that decision does not require anger. It does not require confrontation. It requires clarity. You begin to see that you do not need to explain everything. Not every departure needs a detailed justification. Not every boundary needs to be debated. You can simply step back, reduce contact, withdraw attention, allow distance to do what explanation cannot. And in that distance, something important happens. Your mind begins to settle again. There is a noticeable difference when your environment is clean, not in the physical sense, but in the mental one. You wake up without anticipating conflict. You move through your day without carrying unresolved tension. Your thoughts remain focused because they are not constantly pulled towards something unstable. This is not an abstract benefit. It is practical. It affects how you think, how you work, how you act. And once you experience that level of clarity, it becomes difficult to tolerate anything that disrupts it. Not because you are avoiding difficulty, but because you understand the cost of unnecessary disturbance. You become more selective, not out of arrogance, but out of responsibility. You recognize that your attention is limited, and you choose to invest it where it produces stability, not chaos. There is also a deeper shift that occurs when you remove toxic influence. You stop questioning yourself unnecessarily. When you are constantly exposed to inconsistency, you begin to doubt your own perception. You wonder if you are overreacting, if you are expecting too much, if you are misunderstanding something. But when that influence is removed, your perception stabilizes. You trust your judgment again. This is critical. Because without trust in your own judgment, you are easily influenced. You look outward for confirmation. You adjust your standards to fit what is available. You become reactive instead of intentional. But when your judgment is stable, you move differently. You do not need constant reassurance. You do not need to test your decisions against external approval. You know where you stand. Singleness supports this process because it removes the immediate pressure to tolerate what does not align. You are not forced to maintain something simply because it exists. You have the space to evaluate without urgency, to observe patterns without being drawn into them, to decide without needing to compromise your clarity. There is a certain strength in being able to walk away without hostility, to recognize that something is not right and simply choose not to participate. This is not indifference. It is control. It is the ability to protect your internal state without being consumed by what you are leaving behind. Most people think strength is demonstrated in confrontation, in standing your ground in the middle of conflict. But often the greater strength is demonstrated in absence, in choosing not to engage, in refusing to give attention to something that does not deserve it, in maintaining your peace without needing to prove anything to anyone. This is what it means to guard your inner life, not by isolating yourself from everything, but by being deliberate about what you allow to remain, by recognizing that your environment is not neutral. It either supports your stability or undermines it, and your role is to choose accordingly. As this becomes part of how you operate, your standards begin to rise naturally. Not because you are trying to be selective, but because you are no longer willing to compromise what you have built. You have experienced clarity. You have experienced stability, and you understand that both require protection. This is the deeper function of staying single in this phase, not just avoiding the wrong people, but refining your sense of what is right, not through theory, but through lived experience. You see the difference between calm and chaos, between consistency and confusion, between respect and tolerance. And once those distinctions are clear, your decisions become simpler. You no longer need to analyze every situation in detail. You recognize patterns quickly, you trust your response, and you act accordingly, not impulsively, but decisively. That is what separates someone who is still entangled from someone who has begun to rebuild. One is still reacting, the other is choosing. And that ability to choose without pressure, without fear, without the need to justify every decision is one of the most valuable forms of freedom you can develop, because it allows you to move through life without being shaped by what does not belong to you. There is a moment that comes quietly, almost unnoticed, when solitude stops feeling like something you are enduring and begins to feel like something you are choosing. It does not arrive all at once. It builds gradually through repeated exposure to your own company without resistance. At first, you sit in silence and it feels heavy. Your thoughts move quickly. Your mind searches for distraction. You reach for something to break the stillness, not because there is anything wrong, but because you are not yet accustomed to being fully present with yourself. Most people never move beyond that stage. They interpret discomfort as a sign that something is missing, and they rush to fill it. But what they miss is that the discomfort is not the absence of something external. It is the presence of something internal that has not yet been understood. When you remove constant interaction, constant validation, constant emotional exchange, you begin to hear your own thoughts more clearly. And for someone who has spent years avoiding that clarity, it can feel unfamiliar, even unsettling. But if you remain there, if you do not interrupt the process, something begins to change. The same silence that once felt like pressure starts to feel like space. Your thoughts slow down. You are no longer reacting to every impulse. You begin to observe instead of engage. And in that observation, you start to see yourself more accurately. Not the version shaped by how others respond to you, but the version that exists independently of any external input. This is where a deeper form of stability begins to develop. You stop needing constant engagement to feel occupied. You find that you can move through your day without seeking interruption. A walk becomes enough. A quiet meal becomes enough. Time spent alone no longer feels like something to escape. It becomes something to use. There is a difference between being alone and being at ease in your own presence. Many people experience the first without ever reaching the second. They endure solitude, but they do not settle into it. They treat it as a temporary state, something to move through until they find someone else to share their time with. But when you begin to settle into it, your relationship with yourself changes. You stop treating your own company as insufficient. This is not about isolation. It is about sufficiency. The ability to exist without needing constant external input to stabilize your state. When that ability develops, your behavior shifts in subtle but significant ways. You are no longer drawn to interactions out of restlessness. You do not seek conversations simply to avoid silence. You engage when there is value, not when there is emptiness. I remember noticing this shift in small moments, sitting in a room with nothing demanding my attention and realizing there was no urge to leave it. Walking through a quiet evening without needing to check my phone. Finishing a day without feeling the need to fill the remaining time with noise. These are not dramatic experiences, but they indicate something important. The absence of dependency, because that is what changes when you learn to be at ease alone. You are no longer dependent on others to regulate your state. You do not need someone else's presence to feel stable, and that removes a significant amount of pressure from any future connection. You are not entering it to fix something. You are entering it from a position that is already steady. The Stoics placed great emphasis on this kind of inner independence, not as a form of detachment from life, but as a form of control over one's own condition. Marcus Aurelius wrote about returning to oneself, about finding a place within that is free from interruption. Not because the world is quiet, but because your response to it is measured. That is what solitude trains, the ability to remain composed without external support. There is also a clarity that comes from this state. When you are no longer trying to escape your own company, you begin to see your thoughts without distortion. You recognize patterns that were previously hidden, the habits that weaken you, the impulses that distract you, the areas where you lack discipline. These observations are not always comfortable, but they are necessary, because without them, you cannot adjust. And this is where solitude becomes productive, not in the sense of constant activity, but in the sense of accurate self-awareness. You begin to correct small things, how you use your time, how you respond to discomfort, how you structure your day. These adjustments are not driven by external expectation, they are driven by internal recognition. As this continues, your confidence changes. It is no longer based on how you are received by others. It is based on how you operate when no one is watching. That is a quieter form of confidence, but it is more stable. It does not rise and fall with attention. It does not depend on validation. It is simply the result of knowing that you can rely on yourself. This has a direct impact on how you approach relationships later. You are no longer trying to fill a gap. You are not looking for someone to occupy your time or regulate your emotions. You are looking for alignment, for someone whose presence fits into the structure you have built, not someone who disrupts it. And because you are no longer dependent, your tolerance for misalignment decreases. You notice it earlier. You respond to it more clearly. You do not negotiate your standards in order to maintain connection, because you have already experienced that your life functions without it. There is a certain calm that comes with this. Not the absence of desire, but the absence of urgency. You are no longer rushing towards something. You are allowing things to unfold at their natural pace. You observe, you assess, you decide. And if something does not align, you move on without hesitation because you are not losing anything essential. This is what makes solitude powerful. Not the fact that you are alone, but the fact that you are not weakened by it. You are not diminished by the absence of others. You are not unsettled by quiet. You are not driven by the need to escape yourself. Most people spend years trying to build strength through external means, through achievement, through recognition, through connection. But there is a form of strength that can only be built in solitude, the ability to remain stable when there is nothing to lean on, the ability to think clearly without influence, the ability to act without needing approval. And once that strength is built, it changes everything that follows. You no longer approach life from a position of lack. You approach it from a position of control, not over everything, but over what matters most: your thoughts, your actions, your decisions. This is where the fear of being alone begins to disappear. Not because you have convinced yourself that solitude is ideal, but because you have experienced that it is manageable, that it does not break you, that it does not diminish your life. And once that fear is gone, your choices become cleaner. You are no longer choosing based on avoidance. You are choosing based on alignment. And that difference determines the quality of everything you allow into your life. Because when you can stand alone without resistance, you are no longer at risk of attaching yourself to something simply to avoid the alternative. You have removed the pressure that leads to poor decisions, and in doing so, you have created the conditions for something better to enter without forcing it. That is the strength solitude provides. Not isolation, but independence. Not withdrawal, but clarity. And from that clarity, the next stage of growth becomes possible. There is another layer beneath attachment that often goes unnoticed, and it is not about connection at all. It is about approval. The quiet need to be seen in a certain way, to be accepted without resistance, to feel that your presence is enough in someone else's eyes. At first, this seems harmless. Everyone wants to be valued. But when that desire begins to guide your decisions, it becomes something else. It becomes a dependency that slowly reshapes how you live. You start to measure yourself through someone else's response, not in obvious ways, but in small adjustments. You think before you speak, not to be clear, but to be liked. You choose what to show and what to hide based on how it will be received. You soften your standards so you do not appear difficult. You tolerate what you would normally question because you do not want to lose the connection. And over time, you begin to lose something more important, your ability to stand in your own judgment without needing confirmation. This is how validation works. It does not control you directly. It persuades you to give up control willingly. It tells you that acceptance is more valuable than truth. That harmony is more important than clarity. That being chosen is more important than being aligned. And if you follow that line of thinking long enough, you end up living in a way that is shaped more by perception than by reason. The Stoics were clear about this danger. They warned that once your peace depends on how others see you, you are no longer free. Because opinion is unstable. It changes. It shifts. It is influenced by factors you cannot control. And if your state rises and falls with it, your life becomes reactive. You are no longer deciding how to live. You are adjusting to how you are received. Singleness, when used with discipline, interrupts that pattern. It removes the immediate feedback loop. There is no constant response to guide your behavior, no approval to reinforce your choices, no rejection to distort your self-perception. What remains is your own evaluation, your own standards, your own sense of what is right. At first, this can feel uncertain. Without external confirmation, you begin to question yourself. You wonder if your standards are too high, if your expectations are unrealistic, if your way of living is too rigid. These doubts are natural, especially if you have spent years relying on others to define your value. But if you stay with it, if you continue to act according to your own reasoning, something begins to stabilize. You start to see that your worth does not change based on who notices you, that your value is not increased by attention or decreased by absence. It remains constant regardless of who is present. And once that becomes clear, your behavior shifts. You stop performing, you stop managing impressions. You stop shaping yourself to fit into someone else's expectations. I remember a moment where this became undeniable. Not through a major event, but through a simple realization. I was making decisions without thinking about how they would be received, choosing how to spend my time without considering whether it would be approved, speaking directly without filtering everything through the lens of acceptance. And in that process, I noticed something had changed. There was less tension, less second-guessing, less internal negotiation. That is what happens when validation loses its hold. You become more direct, more consistent, more aligned with your own standards. Not because you are trying to be different, but because you are no longer adjusting yourself to fit into something external. There is also a shift in how you handle rejection. It no longer feels like a judgment of your worth. It becomes information, a sign that something does not align. And because you are no longer dependent on approval, you do not take it personally. You observe it, understand it, and move on without needing to repair your sense of self. This is where a quieter form of strength begins to develop, not the kind that seeks recognition, but the kind that remains stable regardless of how it is perceived. You do not need to prove anything. You do not need to convince anyone. You simply act in accordance with what you know is right. That does not mean you become indifferent to others. It means your actions are no longer driven by the need to be accepted. You can engage without attachment. You can connect without dependence. You can walk away without feeling diminished. Most people do not realize how much of their behavior is shaped by the desire for approval until that approval is removed. They discover that many of their choices were not truly theirs. They were responses to external pressure. And once that pressure is gone, there is a period of adjustment, a process of rediscovering what you actually prefer when no one else is influencing the outcome. This process is not always comfortable. It requires honesty. It requires you to question patterns you have followed for years. It requires you to stand in your own decisions without immediate support. But it also creates something that cannot be taken from you. A stable sense of self that is not dependent on external input. As this develops, your interactions change. You are no longer trying to maintain approval. You are observing whether alignment exists. You notice how someone responds to your standards, to your boundaries, to your consistency. And instead of adjusting yourself to fit, you assess whether they fit into the life you are building. This changes the dynamic entirely. You are no longer in a position of seeking, you are in a position of evaluating, and that shift removes a significant amount of pressure. You do not need every interaction to succeed. You do not need every connection to continue. You are simply observing what aligns and what does not. There is also a reduction in unnecessary effort. You stop over-explaining. You stop justifying your decisions. You stop trying to be understood by people who have not shown the capacity to understand. You conserve your energy for what matters. And that conservation leads to greater clarity. The more you operate this way, the more natural it becomes. You no longer feel the need to check how you are perceived. You move according to your own judgment, and that consistency builds a form of confidence that does not fluctuate. This is the value of stepping away from validation, not to reject it entirely, but to remove its influence over your decisions, to ensure that your actions are guided by reason rather than by the need to be accepted. Because once that is established, your life becomes more stable. You are no longer pulled in different directions by different opinions. You are not constantly adjusting to maintain approval. You are not measuring your worth through external response. You are simply acting in alignment with what you know to be true. And from that position, your relationships become cleaner, not because they are perfect, but because they are chosen without pressure, without the need to prove anything, without the fear of losing something essential. That is what changes when you stop seeking validation. You stop performing. You stop negotiating your identity. You stop shaping yourself for acceptance. And you begin to live in a way that is consistent, stable, and grounded in your own judgment. That is where real control begins. There is a point in solitude where the weight becomes undeniable, not the kind that breaks you, but the kind that forces you to see what you have been avoiding without distraction. The nights feel longer. The silence feels sharper. There are no messages to interrupt your thoughts, no presence to soften the edges of your mind. It is just you facing what remains when everything external is removed. And for most people, this is the moment they try to escape. Not because they are weak, but because they have never been trained to remain steady under that kind of pressure. But pressure, when approached correctly, does not weaken you. It refines you. It reveals where your stability actually lies. Without someone else to regulate your emotions, you begin to see how dependent your state has been on external factors. A message could lift your mood, a delay could unsettle you, a change in tone could disrupt your entire day. These are not small influences. They are indicators that your internal state has been too easily moved by what is outside your control. The Stoics would not view this as a failure, but as a starting point, a clear signal of where your work is required. Because if your peace depends on variables you cannot command, then it is not peace, it is conditional comfort. And conditional comfort will always collapse when conditions change. This is where solitude becomes a form of training, not comfortable, not always pleasant, but necessary. You begin to face moments where your mind wants to react, to reach out, to fill the space, to escape the feeling of being alone, and instead of obeying that impulse, you stay. You observe the discomfort without immediately responding to it. You allow the feeling to exist without attaching action to it. And in doing so, something begins to change. You realize that not every feeling requires movement. Not every moment of discomfort requires resolution. Some feelings pass on their own if you do not feed them. Some thoughts lose their intensity when you do not engage with them. This is a subtle shift, but it is powerful. It introduces a gap between what you feel and what you do. That gap is where control exists. Most people operate without that space. They feel and they act. They are pulled from one state to another without pause. But when you train yourself to remain still in the presence of discomfort, you begin to build resilience, not by avoiding difficulty, but by learning that difficulty does not control your response. I remember a stretch of time where this became clear through repetition. Waking up and feeling the absence of something that used to be there. The instinct was immediate, to reach for the phone, to recreate the connection, to remove the discomfort. But each time I chose not to act, Something small shifted. The feeling did not disappear instantly, but it changed. It lost its urgency. It became something I could observe rather than something I had to escape. Over time, that process builds strength, not in a visible way, but in a structural one. You begin to trust that you can handle what arises, that you do not need immediate solutions for every emotional fluctuation, that you are capable of carrying yourself through moments that would have previously unsettled you. This is what emotional resilience looks like in practice. Not the absence of feeling, but the ability to remain steady while feeling, to experience difficulty without being consumed by it, to acknowledge discomfort without letting it dictate your actions. There is also a shift in how you perceive loss. When you have spent time alone and remained stable, loss loses some of its power. It is no longer something that threatens your entire state. It becomes something you can endure. Not easily, not without impact, but without collapse.
Most people fear being left alone because they have not experienced themselves in that condition long enough to trust it. They assume it will break them. They assume they will not recover. But when you go through it deliberately, when you stay with it and observe how your state evolves over time, you begin to see something different. You see that you adapt, that you stabilize, that you find your footing again without external intervention. And once you have that experience, your relationship with fear changes. You are no longer driven by the need to avoid loss at all costs. You are no longer willing to tolerate misalignment simply because you are afraid of being alone, because you have already proven to yourself that being alone is manageable. That realization has a direct impact on your decisions. You become less reactive. You do not rush to fix situations that are not stable. You do not cling to connections that introduce more tension than clarity. You are willing to step back when something does not align because you are not operating from fear. There is a certain calm that develops from this, not the kind that comes from everything going well, but the kind that comes from knowing you can handle things when they do not. That kind of calm is not easily disturbed. It is built through experience, not through theory. You also begin to notice how much clearer your thinking becomes when it is not constantly influenced by emotional fluctuation. Decisions become simpler. You are not weighing every option through the lens of how it will affect your connection to someone else. You are evaluating based on what is true, what is necessary, what is aligned with your direction. This clarity extends into other areas of your life. Your work becomes more focused. Your habits become more consistent. Your time is used more effectively because your internal state is no longer unstable. You are not constantly recovering from emotional disturbances. You are building forward. There is also a deeper form of independence that develops here, not just in your actions, but in your sense of self. You no longer need external confirmation to feel grounded. You no longer need someone else's presence to stabilize your mood. You carry that stability with you. And that changes how you engage with the world. You are not looking for something to complete you. You are not seeking someone to fix your internal state. You are already stable, already capable, already grounded. And from that position, your interactions become more balanced. You give without needing something in return. You engage without losing your center. You step back without feeling diminished, because your sense of self is no longer tied to external conditions. This is what solitude, when used correctly, builds. Not isolation, but strength. Not detachment from life, but detachment from dependency. The ability to remain steady regardless of what changes around you. And once that ability is established, something else becomes possible. Not just resilience, but a different kind of presence. One that is not easily shaken. One that does not react to every shift. One that remains consistent even when circumstances are not. That is the foundation of real independence. There comes a point after the noise has settled and your inner state has steadied where a different question begins to surface. Not who should be in your life, but what your life is actually built around. Because once you are no longer occupied with managing attachment, you are left with something more demanding: direction. Most people delay this question for as long as possible. It is easier to stay occupied than to define a path.
Easier to react to what appears than to decide what matters. But once you are no longer distracted, once your time and attention are no longer consumed by instability, that avoidance becomes harder to maintain. You begin to see how much of your life has been shaped by response rather than intention. This is where purpose stops being an abstract idea and becomes a practical responsibility. Not something to talk about, but something to structure your life around. The Stoics approach this with clarity. Each person has a role not assigned by others, but determined by their nature, their capacity, and their willingness to act with discipline. To ignore that is to drift. To follow it is to build. When you are in the wrong attachment, your direction is often compromised. Not always in obvious ways. You may still be working, still progressing, still maintaining outward stability, but your focus is divided. Your energy is diluted. Your decisions are influenced by how they will affect the relationship rather than how they align with your path. Over time, this creates a gap, a quiet sense that you are not moving as clearly or as directly as you could. Singleness removes that interference. It does not give you purpose, but it gives you the conditions to pursue it without negotiation. You do not have to explain why you are focused. You do not have to adjust your schedule to accommodate someone else's comfort. You do not have to reduce your ambition to maintain balance. You are free to commit fully. That level of commitment is not easy. It requires sacrifice. It requires you to choose long-term structure over short-term comfort, to accept that some days will feel repetitive, that progress will not always be visible, that discipline must be maintained even when results are delayed. Most people struggle with this because they are accustomed to immediate feedback. In relationships, there is constant interaction, constant reinforcement, constant movement. But purpose does not always provide that. It demands consistency without reward in the beginning. This is where many people lose focus, not because they lack ability, but because they lack patience. They expect movement to feel exciting. They expect progress to be noticeable. And when it is not, they look for something else to engage with, something more immediate, something more responsive. And often that leads them back into patterns that distract them from what they were building. But if you stay with it, if you continue to act in alignment with your direction, even when it feels quiet, something begins to take shape. Not in a dramatic way, but in a steady one. Your skills improve, your thinking sharpens, your discipline becomes more natural, and over time the structure you have built starts to support you. There is a certain respect that comes from this, not from others but from yourself. You begin to see that you are capable of building something that is not dependent on external input, that your life can move forward through your own effort and consistency, and that realization changes how you see everything else. I remember a period where the shift was subtle but undeniable. Days began to feel more directed, not because they were filled with activity, but because each action had a place. There was less hesitation, less distraction, less need to fill time with things that did not contribute to anything meaningful. The work itself became enough. That is what happens when your life is organized around purpose rather than reaction. You stop looking for something to do. You already know what needs to be done, and because of that, your energy is used more effectively. You are not constantly switching between different states. You are moving in a consistent direction. This also changes how you view other people, not in a dismissive way, but in a more grounded one. You are no longer seeking someone to complete your life. You are evaluating whether someone fits into the structure you have built, whether their presence supports your direction or disrupts it, whether they understand the level of commitment required or expect you to compromise it. This does not make you rigid, it makes you clear. You are not rejecting connection, you are refusing to abandon your path for it. And that distinction matters, because one is driven by avoidance, the other by intention. There is also a deeper level of satisfaction that comes from this kind of focus, not the kind that depends on recognition or outcome, but the kind that comes from alignment. Knowing that your actions are consistent with your values, that your time is being used in a way that builds something real, that your effort is not scattered across multiple directions. This satisfaction is quieter than excitement, but it is more stable. It does not fluctuate with external conditions. It remains consistent as long as you remain consistent. And that stability creates a foundation that can support other areas of your life without being compromised by them. Most people underestimate how much of their frustration comes from a lack of direction. They feel restless not because they need something new, but because they have not committed to something fully. They move between different pursuits without depth. They start and stop. They build and abandon. And over time, that inconsistency creates a sense of stagnation. Singleness, when used correctly, breaks that pattern. It removes competing priorities. It allows you to focus on one direction without distraction. And in doing so, it creates the conditions for real progress. Not fast, not always visible, but steady. This is where the idea of mission becomes practical. Not something grand or distant, but something you engage with daily. Through your actions, through your habits, through your decisions. It is not defined by a single outcome, but by the consistency of your effort. And once that becomes part of how you operate, your life begins to take on a different shape. You are no longer reacting to what appears. You are moving according to what you have decided. And that movement creates a sense of control that cannot be achieved through external means. Because control in the Stoic sense is not about managing everything around you, it is about directing yourself. Your thoughts, your actions, your focus. And when those are aligned, everything else becomes secondary. This is the deeper function of staying single in this phase. Not just to avoid distraction, but to build direction. Not just to step away from instability, but to create something stable. Something that does not depend on who is present or what is happening around you. And once that structure is in place, once your life is moving with clarity and consistency, you are no longer at risk of losing yourself in something that does not align, because you have already defined what matters, and you are already acting in accordance with it. That is where real fulfillment begins. There is a quiet shift that happens once your life is no longer organized around distraction or approval. It does not announce itself loudly. It shows up in how you respond to ordinary moments, in how you handle a difficult day without reaching for someone to stabilize you, in how you move through uncertainty without needing immediate reassurance. This is where emotional independence begins to take form, not as an idea, but as a lived condition. Most people do not realize how much of their emotional state has been supported externally until that support is removed. They rely on someone else to calm them down, to validate their thoughts, to confirm their direction, to soften their doubts. And while that may feel like connection, it often creates a dependency that weakens their ability to regulate themselves. When that support disappears, they feel unstable, not because they are incapable, but because they have not practiced carrying themselves. Singleness, when approached with discipline, removes that support system and replaces it with something more demanding. Self-reliance. You are no longer able to outsource your emotional balance. You must learn how to manage it directly. And at first, this can feel overwhelming. The quiet becomes heavier. The doubts feel more present. There is no immediate voice to counter them, no external perspective to stabilize your thinking. It is just you facing what arises. But this is where the work begins. Not in avoiding those moments, but in learning how to move through them without losing control. You begin to observe your reactions more carefully. When something unsettles you, you pause before responding. You ask whether the reaction is necessary, whether it aligns with reason, whether it contributes to stability or disrupts it further. This process is not immediate. It requires repetition. You will have moments where you react too quickly, where your mood shifts more than you would like, where your thoughts become scattered. But each time you notice it, each time you choose to correct your response, you build something stronger. Not perfection, but control. I remember a period where this became clear through contrast. A situation that would have previously unsettled me appeared again, but the response was different. Not because the situation had changed, but because the way I handled it had. There was less urgency, less need to resolve it immediately, more space between the event and the reaction. And in that space there was clarity. That space is what emotional independence creates. It separates what happens from how you respond to it. And once that separation is established, you are no longer controlled by external conditions. You experience them, but you are not governed by them. This does not mean you become indifferent. It means you become steady. You still feel, but your feelings do not dictate your actions. You still care, but your care does not compromise your judgment. You still engage, but your engagement is measured, not reactive. The Stoics emphasize this repeatedly, not the removal of emotion, but the control of it. They understood that emotion, when left unchecked, can distort perception and lead to poor decisions. But when guided by reason, it becomes something you can experience without being dominated by it. This is what you begin to develop in solitude, the ability to experience discomfort without being consumed by it, to feel doubt without abandoning your direction, to face uncertainty without rushing to resolve it through external means. There is also a change in how you view support. It no longer becomes something you rely on for stability. It becomes something you appreciate when it aligns with what you are already capable of maintaining. This distinction matters because it allows you to engage with others without becoming dependent on them. Most people enter relationships with an unspoken expectation that the other person will provide something they cannot sustain themselves: emotional balance, reassurance, direction. And when that expectation is not met, they feel disappointed, even betrayed. But the issue is not always the other person, it is the reliance. When you develop emotional independence, that expectation dissolves. You no longer need someone else to carry your state. You carry it yourself, and because of that, your interactions become cleaner. You are not asking for something you cannot provide. You are not placing a burden on someone else that belongs to you. This also changes how you handle conflict. It no longer destabilizes you in the same way. You are able to observe what is happening without being pulled into it immediately. You assess the situation, consider your response, and act accordingly. Not out of impulse, but out of clarity. There is a certain calm that comes from this. Not because life becomes easier, but because your response becomes more consistent. You are not constantly adjusting to every shift. You remain stable even when conditions are not. And that stability has a direct impact on your confidence, not the kind that comes from external validation, but the kind that comes from knowing you can handle what arises, that you do not need immediate solutions for every difficulty, that you are capable of navigating uncertainty without losing your footing. This confidence is quiet. It does not need to be expressed. It is reflected in how you move, how you speak, how you decide. You are no longer rushed. You are no longer reactive. You are composed. There is also a deeper level of freedom that comes with this. You are no longer tied to how others behave. Their actions do not determine your state. Their responses do not dictate your mood. You are not waiting for something external to settle before you can feel stable. This is what separates dependence from independence. Not the absence of connection, but the absence of reliance. You can connect without needing. You can engage without losing yourself. You can step away without feeling diminished. As this becomes more consistent, your entire approach to relationships changes. You are no longer entering them to find stability. You are entering them from stability. And that difference determines everything. You choose differently. You observe more carefully. You do not rush. You do not overlook what is clear. You do not compromise your standards to maintain connection, because you are not afraid of what happens if the connection ends. That is what emotional independence provides. Not isolation, but strength. Not distance, but clarity. And from that position, your life becomes less reactive and more intentional. You are no longer carried by circumstances. You are directing yourself through them. As your inner state becomes more stable and your direction more defined, something else begins to sharpen without effort. Your standards, not in the sense of rigid rules imposed on others, but in the clarity of what you will and will not allow to remain in your life. This clarity does not come from theory, it comes from contrast. From having experienced disorder and recognizing what it costs you. From having rebuilt your structure and understanding what it takes to maintain it. Most people talk about standards as if they are preferences, things they would like to have if possible, but real standards are not optional. They are boundaries that protect what you have built. And if they are not enforced, they are not standards, they are suggestions. When you are still dependent on connections, standards tend to weaken, not all at once, but gradually. You allow small inconsistencies. You overlook minor misalignments. You tell yourself that no one is perfect, that compromise is necessary, that things will improve over time. And while some flexibility is reasonable, there is a point where it becomes self-neglect, where you are no longer adapting to a situation, but tolerating something that does not fit. Singleness, when used correctly, strengthens your ability to recognize that point early. You are not pressured to accept what is available. You are not negotiating from a position of need. You have already experienced what your life feels like when it is stable, and because of that, you are less willing to introduce anything that disrupts it. There is a difference between someone who understands this through experience and someone who only understands it in theory. The first recognizes patterns quickly. They do not need prolonged exposure to identify misalignment. They see it in behavior, in consistency, in how someone handles small situations. They observe how a person manages their time, their attention, their commitments, and from that they draw conclusions. The second tends to wait, to give more chances, to hope that what is inconsistent will become stable, and often that waiting leads to the same outcome. A realization that could have been made earlier, but was delayed by hesitation. I remember noticing how my tolerance changed without effort. Situations that I would have previously tried to work through no longer required analysis. They were clear from the beginning, not in a judgmental way, but in a practical one. If something disrupted my focus, my routine, or my sense of clarity, it was no longer something I needed to manage. It was something I needed to remove. This is not about becoming intolerant. It is about becoming precise. Understanding that your time and attention are limited and that what you allow into your life shapes how those resources are used. Precision reduces unnecessary complexity. It simplifies your decisions. It removes the need for constant evaluation. There is also a shift in how you handle endings. When your standards are clear, walking away does not feel like a loss in the same way. It feels like alignment. You are not losing something valuable. You are removing something that does not fit, and that distinction changes the emotional weight of the decision. Most people struggle with this because they associate endings with failure. They see them as something to avoid, something that reflects poorly on them. But in reality, the inability to end what is misaligned is what creates long-term problems. It prolongs situations that should have been resolved earlier. It increases the cost of detachment. It complicates what could have been simple. When you operate with clear standards, endings become cleaner. You recognize when something does not align and you act accordingly. Not with hostility, not with explanation, but with decision. You step back. You reduce involvement. You allow distance to establish itself, and in doing so you protect your internal state from unnecessary disruption. There is a certain discipline required for this. Not because it is difficult to see misalignment, but because it can be difficult to act on it, especially when there is still some level of attachment, some familiarity, some comfort. But this is where your previous work matters. The time spent in solitude, the discipline built in your habits, the clarity developed in your thinking. All of it supports your ability to act in accordance with what you know. You are no longer making decisions based on how you feel in the moment. You are making them based on what you have already established as true, and that consistency removes hesitation. You do not need to reconsider every situation from the beginning. You already have a framework. This also changes how you approach new interactions. You are not looking for potential in the same way. You are looking for evidence of consistency, of alignment, of respect, and you allow that evidence to accumulate before you invest further. There is a patience in this approach that most people lack, not passive waiting, but active observation. You give situations time to reveal themselves. You do not rush to define them. You do not assign meaning prematurely. And because of that, you avoid becoming attached to something that has not proven itself. This patience is often misunderstood. It can appear as distance or hesitation, but in reality, it is control. It is the decision to let reality speak before you respond to it. And that decision protects you from unnecessary complication. As this becomes part of how you operate, your life becomes simpler. Not in the sense that nothing difficult happens, but in the sense that you are no longer creating additional complexity through poor decisions. You are not maintaining situations that drain you. You are not investing in what does not align. You are not negotiating your standards to preserve connection. This simplicity has a direct impact on your clarity. Your mind is not occupied with unresolved situations. Your attention is not divided between conflicting priorities. You are able to focus on what matters without interference. And this focus compounds. It strengthens your habits. It improves your work. It stabilizes your direction, because you are not constantly being pulled away from it. Most people underestimate how much of their progress is lost, not through lack of effort, but through misalignment, through allowing things into their life that disrupt their structure, that consume their time, that scatter their attention. And over time, those disruptions accumulate. When you operate with clear standards, you prevent that accumulation. You filter out what does not belong before it has the chance to take hold. And in doing so, you preserve your progress. This is the function of standards at this stage, not to limit your life, but to protect it, to ensure that what you have built remains intact, to create a boundary between what supports your direction and what undermines it. And once that boundary is established, your decisions become more consistent. You are no longer influenced by momentary desire. You are guided by what you have already determined to be true. That is where a different level of control emerges, not over others, but over what you allow to remain. And that control, once developed, shapes everything that follows. There is a belief that sits quietly in the background of most people's lives, shaping their decisions without ever being questioned. The belief that they are incomplete on their own, that something essential is missing until another person enters and fills that space. It sounds harmless, even comforting. But if you follow it closely, you begin to see the cost. Because the moment you accept that you are incomplete, you begin to search from a place of lack. And searching from lack distorts everything. You start to attach meaning too quickly. You interpret attention as value. You confuse presence with alignment. You lower your standards to avoid being alone, not consciously but through small decisions that accumulate over time. You accept what you would normally question. You remain in situations longer than you should. You tell yourself that something is better than nothing without realizing that what you are accepting is shaping who you become. Singleness, when used with clarity, exposes this belief directly. It removes the illusion that something is missing and replaces it with something more demanding. Responsibility for your own completeness, not in the sense of perfection, but in the sense of stability. The understanding that your state does not depend on who is present, that your value is not increased or decreased by external connection. At first, this is difficult to accept, because it requires you to stop searching for something to fill the space and start examining the space itself. What is actually there, what you have avoided, what you have ignored, what you have postponed. These are not always comfortable things to face, but they are necessary. I remember reaching a point where the absence of distraction made something clear. There was no gap to fill, only parts of myself that had not been developed, habits that had not been built, discipline that had not been established, direction that had not been defined. What I had previously interpreted as emptiness was not emptiness at all. It was unstructured potential. This is a critical distinction, because once you see it this way, your approach changes. You are no longer trying to escape your current state. You are working within it. You begin to build what was missing, not by adding someone else, but by strengthening what is already yours. There is a certain weight to this process. It removes the option of external solutions. You cannot rely on someone else to bring clarity to your life. You must create it through your actions, through your habits, through your decisions. And that responsibility, while heavy at first, becomes something else over time. It becomes control. You start to see that your life is not waiting to begin. It is already in motion. And what determines its direction is not who enters it, but how you operate within it. This realization removes urgency. You are no longer chasing something to complete you.
You are building something that is already whole. This does not mean you stop valuing connection. It means you change how you approach it. You are not looking for someone to fix what you have not built. You are looking for someone who aligns with what you have already established. And that difference is significant, because when you are operating from a place of completeness, your decisions are no longer influenced by fear. You do not rush, you do not settle, you do not compromise your standards to maintain connection. You choose deliberately, and if something does not align, you step back without hesitation. Most people never reach this point because they never stay alone long enough to understand themselves. They move from one situation to another, carrying the same patterns with them, the same expectations, the same dependencies, and because of that, the outcome does not change, even if the person does.
But when you remain in solitude long enough to build something stable, you interrupt that pattern. You begin to see your tendencies clearly, the ways you react, the ways you attach, the ways you avoid discomfort, and with that awareness you begin to adjust. You correct small things first: how you spend your time, how you respond to impulse, how you structure your day. These adjustments seem minor, but they create a foundation. And over time, that foundation becomes strong enough to support everything else. There is also a shift in how you view yourself. You stop seeing yourself as someone in need of completion. You begin to see yourself as someone in the process of construction, not finished, but not lacking. Developing, not dependent. And that perspective changes how you carry yourself. You become more grounded, less reactive, more consistent, not because you are trying to appear that way, but because your internal state supports it. You are no longer trying to maintain an image. You are operating from a structure that has been built deliberately. This also affects how others perceive you, not in a way that should concern you, but in a way that reflects your state. When you are not seeking approval, when you are not adjusting yourself to be accepted, when you are not driven by the need to be completed, your presence changes. It becomes more stable, more self-contained, less influenced by external conditions. And while that may attract attention, it is not the goal. The goal is stability, the ability to move through life without being shaped by what is missing. Because once you are no longer defined by absence, you are free to build without pressure. There is a certain calm in this. Not the absence of desire, but the absence of urgency. You are not chasing something to fix your state. You are building something that reflects your values. And that process, while quiet, is powerful, because it removes one of the most common sources of poor decisions, the belief that you need something outside of yourself to be complete. Once that belief is gone, your choices become clearer. You are no longer evaluating situations based on what they provide emotionally. You are evaluating them based on whether they align with what you have built. This clarity simplifies everything. You do not need to overthink every interaction. You do not need to analyze every possibility. You simply observe, assess, and decide. And if something does not fit, you move on without internal conflict. This is what it means to become whole before sharing yourself. Not perfect, not finished, but stable, capable of standing on your own without needing external support. And from that position, any connection you choose to engage in is not a necessity. It is a decision. And that decision, when made from stability rather than lack, carries a different kind of weight. One that does not collapse under pressure. One that does not depend on constant reinforcement. One that is built on something that already exists rather than something that needs to be created. That is the difference between searching and choosing. And once you understand that difference, your entire approach to life changes. When you reach this stage, something becomes unmistakably clear. You are no longer rebuilding, you are maintaining. The chaos that once defined your decisions is no longer present. The urgency that once pushed you toward distraction has faded. What remains is structure, not rigid but consistent, a way of operating that no longer depends on circumstance to stay intact. There is a difference between building something and sustaining it. Building requires effort, correction, repetition. Sustaining requires awareness, the ability to notice when something begins to shift, when your focus starts to drift, when your discipline becomes less precise. And at this stage, the challenge is not to create something new, but to protect what you have already established. Most people do not lose their progress suddenly. They lose it slowly, through small compromises, a slight relaxation of standards, a decision to overlook something that would have previously been clear. These are not dramatic changes, but they accumulate, and over time they begin to erode the structure that was built with effort. This is where vigilance becomes necessary. Not in a tense or defensive way, but in a disciplined one. You remain aware of how you are operating. You observe your habits. You notice when your actions begin to drift from your standards. And you correct it early before it becomes a pattern. I remember noticing this in a subtle way. A few days where my routine became inconsistent. Not significantly, but enough to shift my focus. Tasks delayed, decisions postponed, small distractions that I allowed without questioning. At first it seemed harmless, but the effect was noticeable. My thinking became less clear, my energy less stable, and that was enough to recognize what was happening. The correction was not dramatic. It did not require a complete reset. It required attention, a return to what had already been established, reaffirming the structure, re-engaging with the habits that supported it, and within a short time the clarity returned. This is the nature of maintenance. It is not about intensity, it is about consistency, the ability to recognize deviation and respond to it before it grows. And this ability becomes more refined as you continue to operate with awareness. There is also a shift in how you handle new opportunities at this stage. You are no longer driven by novelty. You do not chase every possibility that appears. You evaluate whether something fits within the structure you have built, whether it supports your direction or disrupts it, and if it does not align, you let it pass. This is where restraint becomes important. Not every opportunity is valuable. Not every connection is necessary. And the discipline to say no, even when something appears appealing, is what protects your progress. Most people struggle with this because they associate opportunity with growth. They believe that more options lead to better outcomes. But without structure, more options lead to fragmentation. They divide your attention, they dilute your focus, and over time they weaken your direction. When you are clear about what you are building, your decisions become simpler. You are not choosing based on what is available. You are choosing based on what aligns, and that alignment reduces unnecessary complexity. There is also a deeper level of self-respect that emerges here. Not in how you present yourself, but in how you treat your own standards. You no longer negotiate them casually. You do not adjust them to accommodate convenience. You hold them consistently because you understand what it took to establish them. This self-respect is not dependent on external validation. It is internal. It is reflected in your actions, in how you use your time, in how you respond to situations, in how you maintain your direction regardless of external pressure. And because of that, your presence changes. You are not easily influenced. You are not easily distracted. You are not easily moved by what does not align. There is a steadiness that becomes noticeable, not because you are trying to demonstrate it, but because it is the result of consistent operation. There is also a calm that comes with this stage, not because life is free of difficulty, but because your response to difficulty is stable. You are no longer reacting to every shift. You are observing, assessing, and responding with clarity. This calm is not passive. It is active control, the ability to remain composed while making decisions, the ability to maintain direction without being pulled off course, the ability to continue building even when conditions are not ideal. And this is where your previous work shows its value, the time spent in solitude, the discipline built through repetition, the clarity developed through reflection. All of it supports your ability to maintain what you have built. You are no longer dependent on external conditions to stay aligned. You have internalized the structure, It is part of how you operate. And because of that, it remains consistent even when circumstances change. This is also where your tolerance for disruption becomes very low. Not because you are inflexible, but because you understand the cost. You have experienced what it takes to build clarity. You have seen how easily it can be disrupted, and you are no longer willing to introduce unnecessary instability. This affects how you evaluate everything, not just people, but habits, environments, commitments. You ask whether something contributes to your structure or takes away from it, and you act accordingly. There is a simplicity in this approach. You are not constantly analyzing every detail. You have a framework. You apply it consistently, and that consistency reduces the need for constant decision-making. Most people operate without that framework. They make decisions based on how they feel in the moment. They adjust constantly. And as a result, their life lacks consistency. It moves, but without clear direction. When you have established your structure and learned to maintain it, your life becomes more stable. Not static, but consistent. You are moving forward, but in a way that is aligned. And this alignment is what allows you to handle complexity without being overwhelmed. Because you are not reacting to everything. You are filtering what matters and focusing on it. This is where control becomes fully integrated. Not something you apply occasionally, but something that defines how you operate. You are not trying to maintain discipline. You are disciplined. You are not trying to be focused. You are focused. And from this position, the final stage becomes possible. Not just maintaining what you have built, but deciding how and when to allow others into it without compromising it. At this point, something changes in how you see connection. It is no longer something you are trying to find. It is something you are deciding whether to allow. That shift is subtle, but it carries weight. Because when you are no longer searching, you are no longer vulnerable to urgency. You are not moving toward people out of restlessness. You are standing still long enough to see clearly what is in front of you. Most people never reach this stage. They move from one attachment to another, carrying the same patterns with them. The same need for validation. The same fear of being alone, the same tendency to compromise their standards to maintain connection. And because of that, the outcome repeats, even if the person changes. But when you have spent enough time building stability, something else begins to guide your decisions. Not emotion, not impulse, not fear, but alignment. You begin to ask different questions. Not whether someone makes you feel something, but whether their presence is consistent. Not whether the connection is intense, but whether it is stable. Not whether it fills a space, but whether it respects the structure you have built. This changes how you observe people. You are not drawn in by what is said in the moment. You watch what is repeated over time. How they handle their commitments, how they manage their time, how they respond when things are not easy. You pay attention to what is consistent because that is what defines reality. I remember noticing how this shifted my perspective completely. What once felt compelling no longer held the same weight. Intensity without consistency became clear very quickly. Attention without structure lost its appeal. It was not that these things disappeared, but that they were no longer enough. This is what happens when your standards are grounded in experience. You are no longer evaluating based on what you want something to be. You are evaluating based on what it actually is. And that reduces confusion. You are not interpreting signals, you are observing patterns. There is also a level of patience that develops here. You are no longer in a hurry to define something. You allow time to reveal what is real. You do not assign meaning prematurely. You do not rush to build something before it has shown itself to be stable. This patience is often misunderstood. It can appear distant or uninterested, but in reality it is disciplined observation. You are giving reality the space to present itself without interference, and because of that your decisions are based on what is true, not what is assumed. This also means you are more willing to walk away early, not because you are dismissive, but because you recognize misalignment quickly. You do not need extended exposure to confirm what is already clear. And by acting early, you prevent unnecessary complication. There is a certain simplicity in this approach. You are not managing multiple possibilities. You are not trying to make something work that does not align. You are either moving forward with clarity or stepping back with control. This is where your previous work shows its value again. The discipline, the solitude, the independence, all of it supports your ability to make these decisions without hesitation. You are not influenced by the fear of losing something, because you know that what you have built is not dependent on what you allow in. There is also a shift in how you show up within connection. You are not trying to impress, you are not adjusting yourself to be accepted. You are consistent, you speak directly, you act in alignment with your standards, and that consistency either aligns with the other person or it does not. You are not trying to create compatibility, you are observing whether it exists, and that removes a significant amount of pressure. You are not responsible for making something work. You are responsible for recognizing whether it should. This is what allows you to engage without losing yourself. You are not merging your identity with someone else's. You are maintaining your structure while interacting with theirs. And if those structures align, the connection develops naturally. If they do not, there is no need to force it. Most people reverse this process. They begin with attachment and try to build structure later. And that often leads to conflict because the foundation was never aligned. But when you begin with structure, when you are already stable, the process becomes clearer. There is also a deeper level of respect that develops from this approach, not just for others but for yourself. You are no longer placing yourself in situations that require you to compromise your standards. You are no longer negotiating your values to maintain connection. You are operating with consistency. And that consistency builds trust, not external trust, but internal. You trust that you will act in accordance with what you know, that you will not ignore what is clear, that you will not allow something to remain simply because it is available. This trust is what removes hesitation. You are not second-guessing your decisions constantly. You are not revisiting the same questions repeatedly. You observe, you decide, and you move accordingly. There is also a calm confidence that comes with this, not because everything is certain, but because your approach is consistent. You know how you will respond. You know what you will allow. You know what you will walk away from. This confidence does not need to be expressed. It is reflected in your actions, in your restraint, in your clarity, in your ability to remain composed, even when something appears promising. And this is what separates someone who is still searching from someone who is choosing. The first is guided by desire. The second is guided by alignment. The first moves toward what feels good. The second moves toward what is right. As this becomes your default way of operating, your life becomes more stable. Not because everything aligns perfectly, but because you are no longer introducing instability through poor decisions. You are filtering what enters. You are maintaining what remains. And from this position, connection is no longer a risk to your structure. It is something that either fits into it or does not. And that distinction removes the fear that once influenced your choices, because you are no longer afraid of being alone. You are no longer dependent on what connection provides. You are already stable. And from that stability, you are finally able to choose without compromise. When everything settles into place, when the noise has been removed and the structure has been built and tested, what remains is not a new version of you. It is a clearer one, not shaped by pressure, not adjusted for acceptance, not driven by the need to escape discomfort, but defined by what you have chosen to keep and what you have chosen to leave behind. There is a quiet strength in that kind of clarity. It does not demand attention. It does not announce itself. It is reflected in how you move through your day, in how you make decisions, in how you respond when things do not go as planned. You are no longer trying to control everything around you. You are focused on what has always been yours to control: your thoughts, your actions, your standards. Looking back, it becomes clear that what once felt like loss was often removal. Not everything that leaves your life takes something from you. Some things leave and return you to yourself. They remove distraction, they remove confusion. They remove the patterns that kept you from seeing clearly. And while that process may not feel comfortable in the moment, it creates space for something more stable to take form. Most people never stay in that space long enough to understand it. They rush to fill it. They mistake silence for absence, and in doing so, they return to the same patterns that kept them unsettled. But when you resist that impulse, when you allow the space to remain and use it deliberately, something changes at a deeper level. You stop reacting to life as it happens and begin directing how you engage with it. This is where the idea of rebuilding becomes complete. Not because everything is perfect, but because the foundation is no longer fragile. You are no longer easily influenced. You are no longer pulled into situations that do not align. You are no longer negotiating your standards to maintain connection. You have established a way of operating that remains consistent. There is also a different kind of peace that emerges here. Not the kind that depends on everything going well, but the kind that exists because you know how to respond when it does not. You have seen your own patterns, you have corrected them. You have built discipline where there was inconsistency, and because of that, your state is no longer easily disturbed. I remember noticing how simple things began to feel. Not easier, but clearer. Decisions that once required extended thought became direct. Situations that once created tension became manageable. There was less internal noise, less hesitation, less need to analyze every possibility. Not because there was nothing to consider, but because the framework was already in place. This is what most people are actually searching for when they look outside themselves. Not another person, not another distraction, but this kind of clarity, the ability to move without constant doubt. The ability to act without needing external confirmation. The ability to remain stable regardless of what changes. And the reality is that cannot be given to you, it has to be built. Through time, through discipline, through the willingness to face yourself without distraction and correct what needs to be corrected. There is also a shift in how you see the future. It is no longer something uncertain that you hope will improve. It is something you are actively shaping, not through control over every outcome, but through control over your actions. You understand that what you do consistently will determine where you end up. And because of that, your focus remains on what is within your control. This removes a significant amount of anxiety. You are not trying to predict everything. You are not trying to manage variables that cannot be managed. You are acting in alignment with what you know and allowing the rest to unfold. This is where Stoic practice becomes lived experience. Not something you think about occasionally, but something that defines how you operate. You are not reacting to events as they happen. You are responding according to principles that remain consistent, regardless of circumstance. There is also a deeper level of self-respect that becomes non-negotiable, not in how you present yourself, but in how you treat your own standards. You do not lower them for convenience. You do not adjust them to maintain connection. You hold them because you understand what it took to establish them. And that self-respect changes how others interact with you, not because you demand anything, but because your consistency creates a clear boundary. You are not easily influenced. You are not easily moved. You are stable. This stability is what allows you to engage with the world without losing yourself in it. You can connect without dependency. You can care without compromising your judgment. You can participate without being shaped by what does not align. Most people never experience this because they never allow themselves the time required to build it. They move too quickly. They avoid discomfort. They fill every space. And in doing so, they never develop the capacity to stand on their own. But when you do, when you stay in that space long enough to understand it, everything else changes. You are no longer searching for something to complete you. You are operating from a place that is already complete. And from that position, your life becomes simpler. Not because there are fewer challenges, but because your response to them is consistent. You are no longer scattered, you are directed. There is no urgency to prove anything, no need to convince anyone, no pressure to maintain something that does not fit. You move according to what you have built, and that is enough. This is what it means to rebuild yourself. Not to become someone else, but to remove what was unnecessary and strengthen what was already there. To strip away what distracted you and refine what supports you. And once that process is complete, you are left with something that cannot be easily taken from you. A way of operating that remains stable regardless of what changes around you. You are no longer reacting to life, you are living it on your own terms. There is nothing missing here. Only what you choose to carry and what you choose to leave behind. When you stop rushing to fill the space, you begin to see it clearly, not as emptiness, but as control. Your time returns to you, your thoughts settle, your standards hold without negotiation. And in that quiet you realize how much of your life was never meant to be given away. You do not need to chase connection to feel complete. You need to remain aligned with what you have already built. That is where stability comes from, not from who stays, but from how you stand. So if you are here alone for now, do not mistake it for absence. Use it. Refine your judgment. Strengthen your discipline. Keep your mind clear and your direction steady. If this stayed with you, leave a quiet mark below, maybe just one word. Clear. And if you choose to keep walking this path, stay close. You are already enough.